Ladies and gentlemen, joining our moderator, please welcome our panelists. Chief Executive Officer, Sproxsil Ashifigogo. Founder and CEO, Buzzcar, Robin Chase. President, Echoing Green, Cheryl Dorsey. Co-founder, Twitter, Chief Creative Officer, Obvious Corporation, Biz Stone.
Thank you all so much for being here. I want to jump into the panel and do a conversation as quickly as possible, but before I do so, let me just briefly frame the situation as I see it. We live in a culture that has a profoundly paradoxical relationship to failure. On the one hand, we all understand that failure is absolutely central to any kind of innovation. The entire scientific process works by essentially proving wrong past hypotheses that we once held as true. The technological process works to a huge extent by trial and error. And essentially, whatever it is you want to do in life, whether it's create educational opportunities in Haiti, or provide services to the international refugee community, or cure type 1 diabetes, or broker peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, whatever your dream is, you are going to fail over and over and over again on your way there. Sorry, I know, grim news for Saturday morning, but here's the thing, that failure is actually the fundamental engine of your advancement. It is the thing that inevitably and ultimately allows you to succeed. And so we all sort of understand this in the abstract, and that's a great thing. The problem is this lovely theoretical appreciation of failure tends to collapse the moment that we actually have to put it into practice. And this is true all along the line, from the day you start kindergarten, all the way through higher education, out into the corporate world, into the NGO world, into the domain of politics, you name it. Our society, what do we actually do? We reward the right answer, we reward success, and we punish failure, and we make you feel ashamed of having failed. So this is obviously a problem, this paradox. And for those of us who feel committed to living in a society that really does foster innovation, we need to do something to resolve it. I don't think we're going to, permanently solve that problem in the next hour here, but I do hope to have a very honest conversation about how failure actually feels, how we experience it, what we're able to do about it. And I'd like to walk out of here today with some really practical, concrete ideas about how we can turn our failures into successful efforts at innovation, and conversely, how we can foster a real culture of innovation by fostering, in turn, a healthy, productive attitude toward intelligent failure. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into some questions here for our panelists. And Robin, I think I'm going to start by putting you on the spot. You are widely regarded as a really top-notch innovator. And if the hypothesis of our morning session here today is correct, that means that you also have some top-notch failures under your belt. And I'd like, if you could start us out by sharing one of those failures with us. And I'm less interested in the kind of nuts and bolts of every single thing that led to it and what went wrong and so forth, than in the human experience of it. What happened? How did you realize it? How did you feel about it? And what did you ultimately do about it?
I'm on the spot because I told her I had a really good one. So when I founded Zipcar, so just the quick lead up, we launched in June. I was out raising $1.3 million. I talked to a lot of people. By the end of September, we had enough cars and enough people that I could go look at my business plan and see how much money had we made based on a utilization. And I had worked on this, I want to say day and night for 3 months. I had been working on the pricing policy, how it was going to work, every scenario. So here it was, end of September. It's actually like the middle of October, because we're now on a paper-based system. Everything is still kind of crummy. So my colleague says, Robin, here's how much money we made with this much utilization. And I want you to know I'm 2 weeks away from sealing this 1.3 million. And it was half of what I expected. So went into my bedroom. We were still working out of my house. And I remember so distinctly, the curtains were drawn. I shut the doors. It was dark in there. And I thought, I'm selling this complete fake thing. This is never going to work. They're about to give me $1.3 million, and it's a complete lie. No one ever talks about how terrible it is. And I felt like my name and my reputation. Everyone in Cambridge and Boston knew what I was doing. All my friends were looking at me. All those investors I had talked to, and it was horrific. It really was horrific. So I actually was in there, I want to say about 2.5 hours, and I think my 4 staff outside on the other side in the guest bedroom, they knocked timidly on the door. Robin. We went out, and we looked together at how I had put stuff together. We found the problem, which was that when I had made calculations, 1 daily rental is not like 24 hourly rentals. Duh, you think it's so obvious, and how could I have missed such an obvious mistake? You've got so many things to do when you're doing a startup. So we changed the daily rate, but just one piece about this I want to say is I was ready to change the daily rate. I said our daily rate is too low. We had it at $45 a day. That was too low to rent a car. My staff were saying, Robin, we now have 400 people who've signed up. Some of them have sold their cars. You made a promise. How can you change this after we are just, this is what we're selling, this is what we're doing. And my point was, it doesn't work. I don't want to keep doing what doesn't work for 3 years until we go bankrupt and then done. This doesn't work. Face it right now. We made a big mistake. So I wrote an email to the 400 members, and I said, we made a big mistake. I need to raise the daily rate by 20%. Push the button, send, and now I had to stand up, walk to work the next morning, because I sent it at 6 o'clock at night, and I was like this, walking into work thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get blasted by all our members who hate it. When I walked in the door, one of my staff members said, Robin, 19 for you, 2 against. And so all of my members were saying, Robin, we knew it was too cheap. We think you're great. We're going to stick with it. And the 2 guys who said they were going to quit and that I was an incredible jerk, I called them up and they said, you're right. And they became our 2 biggest champions. So face mistakes really fast.
It's a wonderful story because it actually gets at so many components of how we should deal with mistakes and also what the experience is actually like. And I want to touch on various of those over the course of this. But one other thing you mentioned is nobody tells you about this stuff, right? There's no conversation about the awful moments when you lock yourself in your bedroom for 3 hours. And I want to maybe start then, or follow up then by asking you, what would you tell people about how to sort of the best first response in that moment of excruciating realization of this thing that I've invested money, time, other people's money and time and my own reputation in, suddenly looks like it might be about to fail. How do you, as a mentor, and let me maybe turn this over to Cheryl, how would you, because you deal with people all the time who are thrilled and excited about their projects and presumably not all of them work out, how do you intervene and keep people from the brink of despair in those moments?
Sure. I mean, failure is a really important topic, and I think it's great that CGIU sort of put it out here because I think sort of, shining a light on it and making all of us much more comfortable about talking about failure is really how you sort of get around it and move through it. And I think at Echoing Green, we talk a lot about sort of different types of failures. So I think, and hopefully this is instructive. I can't see you guys, but I presume it's mostly young people out there in the audience. But sort of there's that type of failure when you're even afraid to start. Like you can't even dip your toe in the water. I've got a paperweight that sits on my desk at home, and it's a quote by Robert Schuller, and it says, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail? And that encapsulates so much to me sort of the inertia that happens when we won't even start because we're just so afraid of the unknown. And sometimes you just have to push through it and walk through it. So that's sort of the first thing. The second thing is just what Robin was talking about, sort of all the little failures, sort of, death by 1,000 failures of when you're trying to get something launched, when you're trying to run a business, whether it's a not-for-profit or a for-profit, the things that happen every day where you're taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, it's inevitable. That's just the way it goes. And you have to get to the point where you have a particular comfort level with uncertainty, complexity, screwing up, and that's just sort of owning it and just being in it and having a circle of support and friends that make it all feel a little less yucky and awful. And then I think the third thing, and I'm sure we'll get to this later because we've got successful entrepreneurs on the stage, And so what happens if you move through that, but you're afraid to go big? Like really going for that moonshot, because there are folks who are just sort of afraid to be audacious and go out there. So I think, you know, there are ways to think about failure in very sophisticated, nuanced ways, but I think, you know, a couple things that we see all the time at Echoing Green is find your kitchen cabinet, your community of supporters that are gonna be with you when you fall down, they're gonna help you get up. Sort of really trust yourself, sort of that notion of having your own North Star. So when everybody is telling you you're crazy, this is ridiculous, why are you doing this? Sort of having that North Star, that point certain that keeps you going when every bit of evidence is telling you to stop is really awfully important.
Can I just jump in
By all means.
and say one of the things about Robin's story that strikes me as totally awesome is that even though it was this horrible thing and she was up all night and it was like super stressful, is that she used her mistake as an opportunity to display her character, and she didn't back away from it. She didn't try to hide from the mistake. She emailed all of the 400 members, no matter how horrible that felt and how it just probably wrong it might have felt at the time. But she used it as an opportunity to say, I made a mistake. This is what the mistake was. This is what we're going to do to fix it so it doesn't happen again. And that vulnerability is super valuable because it builds the brand, it builds trust. Those 400 people can then go and say, the person who created Zipcar and runs Zipcar is incredibly trustworthy and honorable, and you guys should totally sign up. And it's a great branding thing just to show that character.
It's so exactly right, because later on there was another thing that we did that was, I had to raise the rate again because my insurer upped his rate. And so by this time, the next time, I had now a board members. So I wrote another one of these letters, and stupidly, because it was a big issue, I mailed it to my board members, and I said, so here's what I'm sending out tomorrow. And one of them said, are you kidding? Why would you explain this to them? Why would you tell them this? Don't do it. And I said, I'm doing it, even though I was getting advice not to do it. And it was exactly what you said, that I had this incredible trust and following. And when I said bad news, I would tell them good news, our members, but when I told them bad news, and they really were behind me, like Zipcar was like this thing, we were all in it together, all making it happen. And that was really, really important.
I want to actually just emphasize that quickly, because I think it gets at another paradox in our cultural attitude toward error, which is that, you know, we have this idea that a good leader never shows weakness and never admits to being wrong and never changes direction, and that to do any of that amounts to a kind of professional suicide. And in fact, what I think Robin's story and Biz's hearty seconding of it suggests is that the act of being able to stand up and honestly look people in the eye and say, you know what, I made a mistake. Here's what that mistake was, here's why it happened, and hopefully here's how we're going to keep it from happening again in the future, in fact looks like an incredible act of courage and strength and integrity, and can foster real loyalty among your followers or your community and colleagues. So I think that's really important to focus on. But this, you know, it gets at, I think, a question that I think about a lot as regards this particular audience. You know, you guys are aspiring entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs. You have a ton of idealism and energy, but you also, you are products of our culture, and I'm guessing that a vast proportion of you are sort of classic overachievers. How do I know this? It is, again, 8:30 on a Saturday morning, and you are here. And the thing is, what that means is, you know, a lot of you are probably straight A students. You got perfect SAT scores. You've functioned extremely well in a system where your goal is to get the right answer all the time. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel, and Ashifi, I might point to you just because you have the closest ties right now to a university environment. How would you help people make that kind of drastic gear shift from just getting every single answer right to a mode where you're in fact willing and able to get things wrong a whole lot because you have this larger vision that you're trying to serve?
Sure. So I actually have a member of my staff, excuse me, who just finished, you know, top of her class out of her MBA program, and she wants to get everything absolutely right, as if there's some like marking scheme in the real world to which, you know, the person is going to be graded. And the real world doesn't have a marking scheme where, you know, Question A, did you get it right? No. Okay, you're dinged, and so on. So it doesn't work that way. In the real world, you get as close as you can to what you believe is the right answer. So by recognizing that outside school, there isn't an SAT exam with perfect answers, but the best you do is approximate what out there lies as the real answer. You're able to balance the need to be able to find that answer quickly and not give up, perhaps fail on the way to finding the answer, and not worry about potentially getting a B or a C, right? Not trying is an F, so at least you have to try. And when you try, by being able to recognize you may not get it right, you're actually getting closer and closer to being the good approximation of what's out there.
Let me just weigh in now that you said that. When I was sitting in my room, it's coming back to me. That was what really struck me, is I thought, you know, I got those straight A's, and when you're doing that stuff in school, it's actually between you and your teacher and your mom. Like, who else knows whether you got an A or a D? It's really, like, just the three of us. And so it's, yeah, you're proud and it's great, but then, and I was thinking, and since this is the Clinton issue, what I remember thinking in the room and thinking, this is like being a politician and not winning. It's like everyone knows, everyone will know that I was starting this company, and it's so obvious and so big and so out there, and it's not like all the other things I had done where, yeah, I'm a smart person and I know, and no one else really cares whether I got an A or a D. But this was so, so, so out there, and we'll be moving on, and now I'll give one of my good quotes. We all have these great quotes. This is one that the person who founded IBM said: to double your success rate, double your failure rate. And I was doing something that no one had ever done before. How in heck could anyone yell at me for getting it wrong or for doing wrong things? You're doing stuff that's hard and that's new. The best you can do is you try it, and then you try, I guess we'll get to this, you try small things. You want to be iterating. So you try and you screw up and you realize fast that you screwed up. So that, I guess, is one of my big at the end I'll be reminding you. Try learning as fast as you can, so that the failure isn't the issue. The failure is not the problem. You want to learn from that failure. And to this piece about me being overt about my failures for my staff, I felt that by modeling and being overt when I screwed up, I could also tell them that, yeah, you screwed up, because I'm not holding myself to a different bar. You screwed up, and I would never hold it against them. What I would hold against them is when they screwed up 4 months ago and kept doing the same wrong thing for 4 months that we knew 4 months ago was crummy. But of course I was paying attention, so that wouldn't happen. But you really want to catch those mistakes fast and keep moving, and that's how you get better. No one's ever done it before. You see it, you try it, you move on.
Yeah. If I could add to that, essentially never make the same mistake twice. It gets very silly the second time and beyond. But being in school is actually one of the best places to experiment and try things, and if you have to, or if it so happens, fail. Because you have a safety net, right? So you wander off and do something that's not necessarily your schoolwork. And if it all fails, at least you get your degree or diploma, and you could go try to get a job, right? When you're done with school, there is no safety net, right? You fail, you're on the streets, or maybe at grandma's house or something. So it can be a little beneficial to be a student, because in my case, when I was doing research to start the company, I was able to call competitors up and say, I'm a harmless student, I'm doing a research project, can you please tell me X, Y, Z? And they told me everything, right? Today, if I call them and say, you know, I'm your competitor, I'm trying to steal your clients, could you please tell me your secrets? I'll hear a click very quickly, right? So school is one of the best places to take that idea you've always had that you wanted to see pan out and try it. If you fail, you're a student. Nobody really dings students for failing as much, you know, things that are outside the academics that they're supposed to excel at, right? So it's like extra credit. You tried for extra credit, didn't work out too bad.
I would just also add, failure looks great on a resume. I mean, at least for like when we're interviewing for roles at Twitter or at the obvious corporation, my new company, and it says on the resume, I tried to start a company in 2011, and it didn't work. That's usually like, well, tell us about that. And all of the experience you get, the ups and downs and highs and lows of that are usually awesome. That's awesome that you tried that, because that's the kind of spirit we want here at the company. We want you to be willing to sort of double your failure rate, as Robin says. I think it's really great. And the other thing I just wanted to follow up on Robin's example is that, when you think about failure and you think about sort of copping to it, I always think about Harrison Ford as people like Harrison Ford, great actor, great action movie actor. And why is it? It's because he always looks like he doesn't want to get into the fight or jump over the thing. He's like, oh man, Nazis, I hate these guys. And he's not. But the point is, he's not bulletproof. He doesn't show himself as completely bulletproof, because everybody knows there's no such thing as someone who's completely bulletproof and a person that will never make mistakes. So if you try to pull yourself off as that, you automatically start seeming shady and like you're hiding something. So it's almost as if you have to make mistakes every once in a while just to be believable. Otherwise, you're an alien from another planet. Superman.
I think that gets my vote for the best practical piece of advice we've had so far, is that failure looks good on your resume. It makes a ton of intuitive sense to me. The reality about failure is it's a mark of experience. It shows that you're actually not as novice as you might otherwise look when you show up, and it suggests that you've learned something and that you have the courage to admit it and talk about it. So great piece of advice there. I can't help but notice that even here on a panel where we're ostensibly championing failure, this language is creeping in that's like, oh, you're going to wind up, dead in a ditch if you fail after college. and I think that's really telling, because as much as I, and I think everyone here does really believe in this idea that failure is central to innovation, as I said at the very beginning, it does also come with some real costs attached. And so what I want to talk about for a minute is just shift gears slightly and talk about how we can intelligently prevent failure to the extent that it's realistic. Now, obviously, there's kinds of failures that we want to support and make possible because they're going to lead to great breakthroughs. And later on, Biz, I want you to tell the story of how Twitter almost was something else. There's all these stories of products that we now, or processes that we now find just so wonderful that essentially were mistakes. But that said, there are kinds of mistakes and failures that are very costly, and a healthy, intelligent attitude finds ways to be alert to the possibility that they might happen before they happen. And so what I want to ask you about, and Cheryl, maybe I'll start with you. You see proposals for just a vast number of very different kinds of projects all the time, and I'm wondering, you must expect a certain failure rate. You must know that not all of them are going to work, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what you think sort of is an acceptable and normal failure rate, and what kinds of conversations you have or steps you built into the system to try to really figure out how could this go wrong, and what can we do by having a really open conversation about it to prevent that or limit it, or as you suggested, make it happen as quickly as possible and at the least price in both financial and human terms.
Sure. I mean, for those of you who may not have heard of Echoing Green, we're angel investors in the social sector. So every year we launch this global business plan competition for emerging social entrepreneurs, like many of you in the audience. And last year we got 3,509 of these social business plans from 128 countries around the world. At the end of the day, we will fund less than 2% of those. So it's a pretty tough process, but it's an incredible experience and honor to sort of see young people from around the world who are sort of looking at problems in their community and trying to innovate solutions. But at the end of the day, again, we're going to fund 15 to 20 through our venture fund. But at the end of the day, because people come up to me all the time, and I know I'll talk to some of you after this session, it's like, so what do you look for? How are you trying to evaluate these social business plans? And it really comes down to sort of three things. We're looking for the human capital, the talent. We're looking for the idea and the innovative systems changing nature of the idea, and our sense of the ability to execute, because we can, it's 1%. Inspiration, 99% perspiration. You got to be able to execute. But at the end of the day, Echoing Green will always, always privilege the human talent. It is all about the leadership potential of that young social entrepreneur. Because again, you can't sort of predict everything. But again, if you invest in that leader and believe that she or he is going to be able to figure out when things go wrong, iterate, change courses, sort of take in feedback, and then, you know, figure out how to go left instead of right. That is a really smart investment on our part. So at the end of the day, it really is about sort of the leadership at the helm of these social enterprises. And I think at the end of the day, what Echoing Green does is get behind that leader. And we're very fond of saying, if your business plan looks the same way in 2 years after we funded you, then when you submitted that social business plan, something is wrong. You're not innovating enough, you're not pushing the boundaries enough, you're not taking in data from your environment enough, and at the end of the day, if you sort of support that leader as she or he is sort of going through all of the very real difficulties of being an entrepreneur, you sort of get there.
Let me ask a follow-up question. You know, one of the things I think about a lot is in a room like this, there's so much energy, there's so much idealism, there are these wonderful plans and a real sense of commitment around making change in the social sphere and you know, in the for-profit sphere as well. And one of the things I wonder is, how do you balance that kind of energy and idealism of someone who's new to a sphere with, you know, the upside of that energy is obvious. The potential downside is that by definition you are new to a problem and therefore aren't familiar with it in the kind of nuanced way that people who've been hanging around it a lot longer and maybe are a little more jaded have a kind of in-depth knowledge of it. And I guess my question for you is, you know, how do you preserve the energy and the idealism without putting people in a situation where effectively they're reinventing the wheel, they're failing to see problems that a more experienced hand would identify right away? How do you kind of intervene and protect them from unnecessary failures while letting that kind of energy thrive? Ashif, you look like you might have a thought about that.
Sure. So, I mean, 2 years ago I was in school, right? So I'm quite connected with what it means to be a student. And what I did is, I had very few friends my age, because they're all as clueless as I was, right? So how are they going to help? I had lots more friends or contacts who were a little older than me, and a number of them who were actually professors. So I applied the same thought process when I left school, and you have people who you speak with often who are a little older than you are, a little more experienced, so you could balance the enthusiasm. They'll typically be a bit more pessimistic sometimes about things. You're like, oh, that's an old fart, just let them go, right? And then you take your enthusiasm to the fore, but you listen to what they say. You don't always necessarily have to do exactly what they say. You know, sometimes you don't do as they say at all. But you always should listen, because that allows you to essentially put some weights on the enthusiasm, make sure you're not being overly enthusiastic and, you know, walk into a ditch that everybody has sort of seen coming.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, one of the assumptions I always ask people to make when we're working together is to assume that there are more smart people outside our company than inside. I mean, duh. I mean, like right now there's 12 people in our company, so obviously there's more smart people outside the company. But you know, to go to when you're faced with a challenge, to go and talk to folks, and also. I'm always encouraging people to seek out the lost art of apprenticeship and mentoring, and I mean that's what I did. I actually dropped out of school, but I mentored with an older professional, and I got access to him all day long every day and learned a trade. And not only did I learn a trade, but he was much older, so I was able to ask him questions like, how did you know when it was time to propose to your wife? And how much money did you ask for your first job? And he was like, why are you asking me all these questions? And I was like, because you're old, you know things. And so it's just incredible to go out and look for that, because you don't, you know, we're talking about how mistakes are great and everything, but there's mistakes you just don't have to make. I mean, if you just go and talk to somebody like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, and then you talk to someone who's been there, done that, and they're like, don't do that. I've done that 3 times, and it failed every time.
I think, exactly. I mean, when we talk about failure being central to innovation, it's because of the innovation part, right? When you're innovating, you're fundamentally doing something new. By definition, it's not been done before and no one knows how to do it. And in that domain, it's acceptable and inevitable to make mistakes. And what we don't want to do, of course, is make mistakes that a million people have made a million times before. I'm going to ask one more question here, but I also want to go ahead because I'm watching this clock tick down. And if there are questions coming in through Twitter, we can start fielding some of those as well. Which I understand is how they are feeding us questions today. Maybe in honor of Biz. So, raise your hand on the panel and off if you're a perfectionist. If you identify as a perfectionist. You guys are timid or lying, or the lights are too bright. Okay. What about you? Does anyone on this panel identify as a perfectionist? I'm shocked, actually. Okay, I absolutely identify as a perfectionist. And I bring it up because literally, you know, I am in my like almost late 30s at this point, and it was only last year that it dawned on me that this was not an absolute good in life. That in fact, perfectionism can be, it's great in certain ways. It inspires you to work very, very hard, but it means that we punish ourselves really cruelly when we do in fact fail. Robin, yes?
I have a daughter who's one of those, and if I looked at so we haven't talked about money and time yet, but there's that 80-20 rule, and what you really want to be doing is you want to be spending you want to be getting it 80% right for the 20% amount of money, and it's that last 20% of perfection that costs you the 80% of the money. And so again and again, do it good enough, move on, good enough, move on, good enough, move on. And each time you'll be closing the gap to perfection. Yeah. But absolutely do it with the least possible way you can get something done to start figuring out what do people want to buy, what is it that they're interested, what works, what doesn't work, and you want to get it, you want to make those trials with the least cost, least time possible. And we were discussing people's second and third companies. When people get really smart, when people get successful, they think, now I understand this market. Let me tell you, I'm going to spend 2 years, $N million, I'm going to build it all out, and then I'm going to go to market. What happens? They screw it up every time. You just threw away those 2 years. What you want to do is you want to say, what is the least thing I can do to start testing and seeing how it works out? So perfectionism is absolutely the enemy of forward progress.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And, you know, when I was in my 20s, no one was as harsh or as cruel to me as I was to myself, right? Sort of that talk in your head like, oh, it's just not good enough. Why aren't you doing that? You know, 20 years ago, Echoing Green gave me money to start my social enterprise. And at that time, you know, I worked 20 hours a day. And I thought I had to do everything. I had to be just as good as the Xeroxing as I had to do, you know, be on sort of the medical outreach program as I was on fundraising. And it was exhausting and unnecessary. So that, you know, instead of asking for help, which I really saw as a sign of weakness in my 20s, I wish I knew then what I know now, that it was not at all a sign of weakness to just sort of open your circle and say, you know, I'm really good at some things, but I'm not great at others, and that's okay. And that's where you start to build your team. That's when you start to become more effective. And again, I just wish I had figured that out 20 years ago.
That I'm going to nominate. I'll let you speak in 1 second, Biz, but I just want to nominate that as another really excellent piece of practical advice. The ability to say, help, please, this is not my strong suit, is crucial. It's not a sign that you don't have other strong suits, and in fact, it is its own kind of strength to be able to say, here's where I'm not good, I need your help, or here's a problem I'm having, I don't seem to be able to solve it, who else can help me out here?
Or when you're building a company, just hire people that are way smarter than you, and then leave. But this 80-20 rule is great. Like in software, MVP stands for minimum viable product. The first time I heard that, I was like, MVP? What do we have, an employee of the month or something? But it's just like, what's the worst possible thing we can release just to get something out there so that people can give us feedback, you know? And so that's what you do. You just iterate and you get crappy stuff out. And I met a guy, we were 2 years into Twitter, and we were constantly failing and falling down because we didn't expect it to be successful. And I met a guy who had spent those same 2 years. I went down to visit him, and he said, we built a similar product that can scale to tens of millions of users, and nobody's using it. I'd rather have your problem, where everyone's using it and it's breaking, than nobody's using my perfectly scalable product.
I mean,
just to be really overt when we say minimum viable product to get it out there, because we know with certainty that there's going to be all this stuff that doesn't work. We're anticipating failure so that you can redirect, and that's the point, is to you're knowing it's not right, and it's to move on.
Now, this big companies with big names and impressive resumes also do this as well, right? When you set up your computer and get those Windows updates. Guess what they're doing? They're fixing things they didn't get right the first time they shipped out a computer to you, right? So when this occurred to me, even if the big guys still do this, right, it's totally okay for the up and coming to do it as well. But make sure it's not too crappy, because then the feedback you get is this would never work, and you may begin to give up, right? So it has to at least work.
Viable.
Viable. It has to work in order to be able to get the right feedback. Otherwise, you may be led astray.
Right, I'm glad you emphasized viable, because I think both pieces of that equation are equally important. We seem to be hearing over and over again, get it out quickly with the lowest possible cost and resources and time. It's a draft, and the entire community who uses it will help you improve it. But it does need to be good enough that it doesn't just sabotage your reputation the moment you put it out there. Ashifi, I want to ask you a question on a little bit of a different line. You are, as I understand it, the first ever PhD in innovation from Dartmouth University. Is that correct?
It sounds fancy, but yeah, essentially.
So here's what I want to know.
It is fancy.
It is fancy, right? What does it mean to study innovation, and what can you learn in that context? And more specifically, can you just distill for our audience what you think of are the most crucial lessons that you yourself have taken away from those studies?
Sure. So the PhD innovation program at Dartmouth is pretty interesting. Essentially, the dean realized that a couple of students who were doing their research all right, and just checking the boxes, making sure they weren't failing, but they had cooler things going on at night. So it was of interest to see how can we formalize these ideas that are brewing in the university, so they don't just write theses, shove them on the shelf of the library, and then go work somewhere else and not grow their ideas. So the program allows students to take their ideas, gives them entrepreneurial training, and then they're able to go out in the world and sometimes start companies, but at least think more like entrepreneurs. I think the biggest lesson I learned was one that the panel has brought up today, which is if you don't try, you've already failed, right? So you should at least try. And then after I graduated, that's when I realized that the best time to try is when you're in school. That's absolutely the best time to try, and you have the opportunity to do that. Before you graduate, because when you get out in the real world, it gets a little tougher. There are fewer resources. You can knock on your professor's door and get some free advice. They'll say, oh, I'm a consultant now, I'm not a professor, so now you have to pay ridiculous hourly rates or something like that, right? There's a lot you can get out of being a student, and you should definitely use it before it times out.
Speaking of the real world,
my friend Mark Ginsburg's dad was this, like, a scary dude. Like, he was a dentist, and he was kind of gruff, and we were always hanging around the house, like, playing Nintendo and stuff, and he wanted us to go out and, like, get girlfriends and not be nerds. And he was like, and his advice was similar to yours, but phrased in a different way. Boys, if you don't buy a lottery ticket, you're not even going to have a chance of winning. And we were like, what? Should we pay the lottery?
A Mega Millions appropriate comment there. I want to take a couple of questions that are coming into us from Twitter here. Laura Lee Adams, who's apparently is watching this by webcast, raises, I think, a really crucial question that actually gets at your point about the real world here. She says, I teach first-year English, and my students are increasingly anxious about their performance in light of the economy and the need to compete for what they perceive as fewer opportunities. So it's lovely to have this conversation about failure, about trying things that don't work out, but if you graduate from university and you feel like you're under tremendous economic pressure just to pay back your loans, just to make it, make ends meet and make rent, how, practically speaking, can you still continue to follow your entrepreneurial or social dreams? A small question.
Well, my advice in that particular case is usually to go and find volunteer work to do, because the most depressing thing is to just have interview after interview after interview after interview where you're turned down, and then your confidence level goes way down, and then that shows in your next interview, and you come across as having zero confidence or lack of interest. Whereas if you just go out and volunteer somewhere, you're working hard, you're feeling really good about yourself because you're doing something meaningful, and you're actually working elbow to elbow with people who have jobs, so you're networking as well. So while you may be doing something altruistic, you're actually helping yourself by boosting your confidence, by networking, by doing all these great things. So yeah, that's not going to pay the bills, but it's a much faster route to to actually getting a job than just a bunch of interviews, I think.
I want to second that thinking of failure, I was down to my last $68 as a student, as a graduate, as a graduate, and because I kept wanting to find the job that I thought I needed to find. And I did some temp work, which was the bottom of the bottom. I said, okay, I'll go be a secretary. I know how to type for a couple hours. And no kidding, the first one I went and did, they said, Robin, you're fabulous. We want you to go do these great things. It literally was within 24 hours that they offered me a 3-month stint. So you really do take all those crummy jobs. But I feel like this question, maybe we're not answering the question the way they had anticipated. We talked, I think you can do something simultaneously. You keep saying that you've got to do it while you're in school, and that's a great opportunity. I want to say that I started Zipcar when I had 3 children and a spouse, and there I would say, what was my cover? My cover was that I had a spouse, so someone else was covering for rent. But so I would say, move home. If you're really yearning to do this thing, do minimize your resource out, what you're spending. And there is 0 shame in that, and I actually think it's a fabulous thing. But practically speaking, students who don't have any children have fewer costs and more flexibility than people who have a spouse and children and health care that they have to cover. So it's not just undergraduate that you have opportunities. Afterwards, you also have opportunities. And we've been discussing here a lot about how doing something light. So keep the day job if you manage to have one, and do this light touch on nights and weekends. And at a certain point, I think you'll feel comfortable in saying, okay, now it's time to lose the day job and go all in. I think that will be it'll feel like you're doing way too much at one time, and then when the time is right, it'll be clear to you that the time is right, because you'll have had enough success and you'll be able to ditch the day job.
The time it kicked in for me was when I realized even if I didn't make a dime of developing technologies to help people avoid fake drugs, I would enjoy that much more than the other thing that I was doing, right? And so when you begin to feel that way, just push the button and go. That's the kind of passion you need to succeed, because you're probably not going to make a dime for a while. So do it while you enjoy not making a dime versus versus having to do it as a sort of a last resort.
Someone over Twitter has asked the question of how she says, how can our startup on a small budget manage its failures to make them work for us? And I actually want to make that question very, very specific. If you are starting a small company, do you guys actually have a percentage that you recommend, or a way that you recommend to essentially write failure as a line item into your budget? What should people be expecting in terms of a cushion for when things don't work out?
I don't have an answer to that, but for inspirationally, Zipcar launched and had 3 cars on the road, and I had raised $75,000. So we did the website, I got the cars, I had people using it, and I had only spent $75,000, which to this day I am dumbfounded by, and I don't think I could do again, but we did do it. And so we did it with a lot of friends, doing a lot of help and a lot of promises and a lot of IOUs, and we got it done. So one of our failures was a technology failure, that this guy was building the box for the car. He had worked on it for 6 weeks. He demoed it in my car, and when I saw the box, and I looked at him, and clearly I had this, it was kind of like this Rube Goldberg incredible thing. Clearly the horror on my face was so huge, he never billed me.
Well, just getting to the idea of the line item, if you treat failure the way that Robin did, you might be able to take it out of your marketing budget. I mean, if you turn vulnerability into value, and you actually just highlight your mistakes and explain what it was that was the mistake, what it is that you're going to do about it, and why it's not going to happen again, then it's a brand building opportunity, and you could go ahead and say that it's part of marketing.
What about, let me ask you guys about plan B. Like when you're, busy, you're someone who you see a lot of startups come and some number of them go, right? And I'm wondering, when when people step back and say, are we going to invest in this or not, to what extent, presumably, you're trying to figure out, is this company going to succeed? Do I want to be on board with this? And I'm wondering, given that we all are acknowledging that the risk of failure is intrinsic to pulling off really fabulous successes, how, when you're looking at a startup plan, do you assess the risk of failure against the possibility of success? And what can an enterprising young would-be entrepreneur with a startup idea say to you or say to any funder to try to seem savvy about and realistic about the possibility of failure?
I guess what I usually look for is an emotional investment in what they're doing. And very often it's the business model at the end of the pitch that ruins the whole pitch. Because what you really want to look for is a passionate entrepreneur who just has so much emotional investment and so much enthusiasm that you get the impression that they're going to overcome any obstacle that comes their way, and that they'd be willing to pivot or completely change what they're working on. I advise companies, and sometimes they come to me and they say, okay, so here's what we're going to do. Will you be an advisor? And I say, sure, but you'll probably in 6 months come back to me and say, that was a really stupid idea. We're going to do this now. And they're like, why would you say that to me? I'm just getting started. That's not very helpful. And then inevitably they come back and they're like, that first thing was really dumb. We were talking backstage about Katerina Fake, the co-founder of Flickr, and how Flickr was originally this massive multiplayer online game. And inside the game, your little characters could share photos, and they were just like about to give up. It was confusing. It was off track. There was infighting, and they said, what if we just let people share just photos and just took all the other stuff out? And that became like the hit product.
And when she told me that, though, it was the absolute last ditch. They had days away from being completely done. And so something I think, this distinction between success and failure that I feel like we haven't been clear enough, it's this, when I'm interviewing people, I ask them, what is something you're proud of? And I feel like I could be more overt, which is, tell me something you did that was incredibly hard, and how did you go about it? It's going to suck. It's going to be something really terrible. Tell me. I want to know, and your ability to succeed is going to be what you did with that giant obstacle. There was that giant obstacle, and how fast did you see it was an obstacle, and what was your thought process about how to get around it or to do something different?
Can I just say, in the early stages, startup entrepreneurs, your funders and investors are investing in you. It really is about their belief in you and your vision. And so I think there's a level of authenticity that has to come to the relationship, and sort of, coming with the bravado, like everything's perfect, it's great, I've got it all figured out, that wears very thin very quickly. So I think when you're sort of forging those relationships, just really being vulnerable and putting yourself out there and recognizing that you're trying to build relationships for the long haul are really, really important.
We are unfortunately technically out of time here, so I just want to wrap this up. And to do so, I want to ask each of you, these are really, really wonderful thoughts. I love the idea of embracing the hardest thing we've ever done and talking our way through it, recognizing that those are the moments that show our character and show our ability to move forward through failure and make something of it. I want to ask each of you, and this is a brutal thing to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. Before we go, can you just distill down your own personal single best piece of advice about dealing with obstacles, dealing with failure, dealing with the awful moments when your beloved dream seems like it's collapsing out from under you? What single piece of practical advice would you like to leave for our audience members today before we get out of here? And Ashifi, I'll start with you.
Sure. I'll be very frank. Just move on. It's not the worst thing that ever happened in humanity. You wake up tomorrow, and the world moves on. So don't get stuck in the hole, because then you're really going to lose.
We haven't talked about one of my favorite things that I call intellectual honesty. So you are selling in your own brain. Listen, and pay attention. When 25 people have told you it sucks and you can't think of any other reason except for you want to keep doing it, really be honest. What's the feedback? How skilled are you at this? That is for me the number one thing, is listen and be honest with what your skills are, what your idea is. I started Zipcar at the end of the .com, and people had some really bad ideas. and it took them a long time and divorces and a lot of money wasted to get through it. And I think cut your losses soon, which doesn't mean try something really hard and keep going, because that could be the intellectually honest thing to do. But really be honest with yourself and your own mind. And Cheryl just said one thing that I want to urge you some caution. Don't go to those funders and tell them everything. So you're going to be honest about it, but you're going to be honest in a strength perspective. It's to you yourself and to you and your two favorite secret advisors that never tell anyone else what the real problems are. Sorry, Cheryl.
No, I don't disagree with you. But I mean, I do think, you know, we see it unfortunately all the time where people sort of lead with sort of a false sense of strength when you can sort of be honest and say, look, there's some challenges, but we're working our way through them. So that has worked really well. You know, it's interesting. We've worked with close to 600 social entrepreneurs working all over the world, and they work on a ton of different things, but they're very similar in sort of their qualities and characteristics that make them these extraordinary social change leaders. And one of the qualities that is common amongst all of them is something we call blessed naivete, willful naivete. Sort of, again, the world is telling you, no, 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 this is crazy, stop, there are other people doing this. And there's sort of this protective shell that is really quite common in sort of these young social entrepreneurs that get up and do it anyway. And I just love to sort of see sort of that courage and that audacity to walk through the world and recognize that it can be different before the rest of the world has caught up with you, and be okay with that. And it feels very lonely at times. You get a lot of pushback, but at the end of the day, trust that inner voice. I always say your gut is some of the best form of data that you will ever have access to, and just trust it.
Biz, can you get us out of here in 30 seconds?
Sure. We call that hallucinogenic optimism. My advice is, in order to succeed spectacularly, you need to be willing to fail spectacularly.
Very straightforward. All right, so the ability to move on, intellectual honesty, humility, hallucinogenic optimism, and a willingness to fail spectacularly. I wish that for all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today.